This is Dr. Chris's Radio Horror Show here in 91.3 FM WCW, and tonight we are having a returning guest to our show to focus a little bit more about a little piece of his career. The last time he came on the show, D.G. Chichester came on to talk to us about his time as a writer and editor and working for Marvel in the 90s, and we touched upon a little bit about his time as the editor of the Clive Barker books from the Epic line of Marvel Comics. Gigi's back on with us to talk to us about the beginning, the middle, and the end of that whole... Thank you for coming back on the show, says Gigi.
Oh, it's awesome, Chris. Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance. Love the last interview, and the Clive Barker stuff was a big part of my career, I think, in comics, and stuff I was very proud of and excited to work on. So it doesn't get talked about as much as some other things, so it's always a nice time to visit that world.
I don't see a lot of it out there. I mean, I watch a lot of different, like interesting factoid, little history documentaries about comics when it comes to stuff on YouTube, and documentaries about people in general. There's a documentary about Dave Stevens that just came out, and there's documentaries about living, our artists and writers, such as like Mike Mignola had a documentary come out about him this year. But I don't see the Clive Barker comic book stuff get talked about nearly as much. How did that all get started at Marvel? I mean, how did that just begin?
Yeah, no, it's a good history there, and just as a side note on that, I think that it deserves it. I think Clive did a lot of great horror comics work at that time. His influence extended from the stuff we were doing at Epic. Eclipse, was big into it, and Clive was such a very positive force for creativity. And a big fan of comics, that I think that the work he did and helped other people do, really contributed to a time when a lot of horror comics weren't being done. So filmmakers out there, take notice. This is a good topic to jump on. But but the way I got involved was I was an editor at Epic Comics, which was run by the talented, legendary Archie Goodwin. And Archie, of course, among his many other credits, had a reputation and history doing horror comics. So the Warren comics that he had worked on certainly had horror anthologies of their own, eerie and creepy and some other stuff like that. So he had a history in that genre, and we would talk about it from time to time. And I was a big horror fan, and my thinking was, why aren't we at Epic doing some kind of horror anthology or some kind of horror comic, that I could be in charge of then? Shamelessly selling myself. And Archie, in his wisdom, said, yeah, horror comics are great, but they do not sell. And we need a hook to make it sell more than, just another Crypt Keeper or, riff on an EC comic or whatever. So every time I'd ask, he'd kind of, patience, kid, maybe something will happen. Well, the something that happened was Marvel at one point got bought by New World Pictures. New World Pictures at that point was the producers of Clive Barker's Hellraiser films. And it turned out that a friend of Clive's, a guy named Eric Saltzgaber, was part of New World's international film distribution. Eric was a comics fan. Knew Clive was a comics fan. Eric ended up being the facilitator through this New World Pictures acquisition to sort of say, hey, we're all sort of the same family here. Clive has an interest in talking about some kind of comics thing. Could he come in, to the office, to meet with Archie Goodwin? Because of the creator-owned aspect of Epic Comics. And of course, Archie, being no fool, said, yeah, that sounds really interesting. Let's see what comes of that. And it was the most shameless moment of my comics career, probably, was Mark Chiarello, who would later go on to be a very influential artistic editor at DC Comics, as well as a creator in his own right, was working at Epic as sort of our administrative assistant, our receptionist. It was way below his abilities, but he liked doing it because he was there in the office and he was getting the groove on with comics. And it was Mark's job really to greet new people who were coming into the office. They'd call from the front desk and say, so and so's here to see Archie, and Mark would go and escort them back to where the Epic offices were. So when the call came back that Clive Barker was coming, was there at the door, I was like the ultimate fanboy. I like squeed pretty much, and pushed Mark out of the way and ran to be the one to escort him back, which meant nothing to Clive, at the time. Clive was perfectly charming, but he was there to see Archie Goodwin. And so introduced him to Archie. They went into Archie's office and talked for a good while. And when he emerged, he went his Clive Barker way, and Archie came into my office and said, essentially, well, be careful what you wish for, because you just got it. We're doing a Hellraiser comic as an anthology, and you're going to be in charge of it. So it was as simple as that, in the sense that Clive had, so much influence. He was white hot at the time. He was a best-selling author. His films had, caught a lot of attention, and they're kind of rogue element of stuff. And now with this, he was going to, hit another media area with his influence, and we were going to be part of this. But the immediate problem was, great, Hellraiser had come out. I think Hellraiser 2 was about to come out. I remember we got an early video copy to sort of review and see. But beyond what you saw on the screen, what did you know about any of this, right? What was the big diamond thing in Hellraiser 2? What were the Cenobites? What were the rules of hell in any way, shape, or form? And these were unanswered questions and would have to be answered. So that's part one of kind of getting in there. So let me pause, because I'll just keep rambling on, and to see if you got anything to add to that.
Yeah. Let's take a look about when Hellraiser 2 came out, because I don't remember if that was still in the 80s or not. Because Hellraiser 1 came out in 1987, correct?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. So, and Hellraiser 2 came out in 1988. So the line of comics started in 88, 89?
Yeah, that sounds about right. Because
Okay.
it was definitely Hellraiser 2 was about to come out, or had just come out, as I said, but because that was part of our discussion, around establishing the groundwork of what the comic would become as an anthology, and how we would want to make it work.
And yeah, because Epic had started in 82, and then it folded when Marvel went bankrupt in 96. And
I think they had essentially retired the line for what it really represented earlier than that. But I was out of the business, out of that bit part of the business in that way, certainly by that point. So, did Epic only start in 82? Really? I thought it started a little bit earlier than that. But
yeah, it says the imprint from Marvel started in 82. But yeah, I mean, that makes sense, considering ElfQuest was one of the first big imprints from that. That was in the 80s. So
sure. Epic Illustrated was first, and then other things like ElfQuest came in. So
the first book was Clive Barker's Hellraiser.
Was Clive Barker's Hellraiser?
Okay, that was the what do you call it? They're not floppies. It's the other kind of comic book, prestige format.
Prestige format. Like what would, after the graphic novels sort of like moved on from being the large format pieces. But yeah, prestige format, graphic novel format. Perfect bound, is another way to call it, because it's got the squarish edge to it. The initial ones were, I believe, I want to say 64 pages. And I think we were doing them bi-monthly or monthly, maybe at the most, probably bi-monthly. And what we had to do, though, is we had to convene kind of a panel of experts to kind of work this out. So that was myself, Archie, Clive, obviously, and then we brought in Eric Saltzgaber, who was the guy I mentioned earlier, who I knew was, just from my conversations with him on the phone, was very interested in breaking into comics, as well as the work he was doing in the film industry. and he seemed to have a good groove with Clive. And we also brought in a horror author named Phil Nutman. And the reason we brought Phil in was we had sort of mistakenly gotten the impression Phil was kind of part of Clive's inner circle. And so we were trying to be a little bit political. So we'd included Phil in these initial, round table discussions. That later turned out not to quite be the case. But it was fine because Phil ended up contributing, some good thinking in the discussions. But what we really had to do was we had to pick Clive's brain and then make sense of what this whole thing was, right? What is Leviathan actually? Why do the Cenobites act the way they do? What are the rules of Clive's hell? Why do people get sucked in? What is the puzzle box? These were questions that were sort of not really answered in the movies. The movies sort of operated on kind of raw Clive Barker power, if you will. And so we had to break this down, because what we would have to do in bringing in creative teams would be to basically provide them with a series Bible. And this series Bible would have to say, hey, we would like you to be part of this anthology and pitch us stories, as an artist or writer, an artist-writer team, whatever it would be. But in order to pitch us stories that really weren't going to be just Twilight Zone tropes or Crypt Keeper tropes, or O. Henry tropes or whatever, we wanted to be able to say, this is what hell represents. These are the kind of stories we're looking for. If you want to use the puzzle box, here's the rules of the puzzle box, that sort of thing. So in these discussions, there's a lot of give and take. It wasn't just, a checklist of asking Clive, well, what is this? What is this? Tell us. Obviously fabulous imagination, but he was all in on listening to other people and then building on what other people said. Sort of the first exposure of this guy's thought process and what a great creative lead, contributor, collaborator, I think he would become throughout all of these books. And so doing that, we then turned this, or I turned it, because I was the one who took everything, and I wrote what I've always called a series Bible, the Clive Barker's Hellraiser Bible, which explained all these things, which for listeners who are on here, if you are at all interested in actually reading that Bible, and you subscribe to my newsletter, shameless plug, at storymaze.substack.com, that is the premium offer I give to free subscribers. You get that Bible, and you get to see, that sort of behind the scenes that was sent out to creative teams. So then we started to recruit creative teams, and I was aiming really high because I wanted a certain kind of caliber of talent on the book. So we went after real cream of the crop folks in my mind to bring them in and get them interested in contributing stories of various lengths, as well as pin-up art. If you remember the anthology, if you can find original copies of it nowadays, it not only featured these stories, but a real fabulous gallery of single image illustrations throughout that either brought to life new Cenobites, old Cenobites, as well as just sort of visualizations of hell. Mm-hmm. So it was a pretty fabulous combination of stuff in there.
So the titles that were produced by the Epic line were, there was the main Hellraiser book, 1 through 20. There was Clive Barker's Book of the Damned, a Hellraiser companion. Hellraiser mm-hmm. versus Nightbreed Jihad, which I think I had seen before, but I just never picked up until I realized this was a Hellraiser Nightbreed crossover.
Yes, indeed.
Something
yes.
called Epic Book 1. Mm-hmm. The Hellraiser 3 film adaptation, which is interesting that only the third film has ever had an adaptation in the comic book format. Mm-hmm. Hellraiser Summer Special, Hellraiser Holiday Special.
Yeah. Yes, God help us.
Yeah,
yes,
the Pinhead series, which
yes.
in my opinion, is not as good as the actual Hellraiser book itself.
Mm-hmm.
Pinhead versus Martial Law, Law and Hell, which every time I saw that, and before I ever saw the cover, I thought maybe that was Pinhead versus, like, what's the guy? Sylvester Stallone played him. Judge Dredd.
Judge Dredd. Yeah, very the guys who worked on martial law, had history with 2000 AD and that character as well.
Okay, yeah. Clive Barker's The Harrowers, Clive Barker's Hellbreed, and Hellraiser Spring Slaughter. However, there's another one that's not listed here in this list, I found out. Is it Damnation Game? No, what's the...
Weave World.
Weave World is not listed on this list for some reason, because there was a Weave World adaptation in the comic book, too.
Yeah. There's a few others you're missing as well, because the progression went from the anthology of Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Then we worked on the adaptation and extension of Nightbreed, because Hellraiser was working out so well and Clive was happy with the way things were going. We brought that to life, and we could talk about that some more if you'd like.
Yeah.
And then from there, Clive was like, well, hey, these are both. So what's your ideas for the Hellraiser Nightbreed crossover? And I was like, what Hellraiser Nightbreed crossover? Oh, we should do a Hellraiser Nightbreed crossover. So then that came to life, because that was, a jumping off point for him.
Uh-huh.
Then we started to do some of those, wackadoo, sort of one-offs, like you were saying, the summer special, the holiday special, which was a way, frankly, to kind of use up inventory that we had gathered up on the anthology. And because the anthology had fallen back to a slower schedule, we still had a lot of stories to kind of get out. So that was a way to sort of, move the material out through a different channel than the normal ones. As you said, Weave World would become a limited series on its own. Pinhead would become a series. And again, we can dig into that a bit more. But I think what you're missing, and the Harrow is one part of that, is what we called, internally at least, is the Barkerverse. So Clive had pitched a number of original ideas, that were not tied to Hellraiser, and so there were 3 or 4 of these, and I want to say, I don't remember all the titles off the top of my head. I mean, there was I think one was Saint Sinner, these I were not as directly involved with. They kind of continued on. Marcus McLaurin, was it the Razor Line? It's the Razor Line, it was called, actually. So I'm looking it up right now. So there was Ecto Kid, there was Hokum and Hex, there was Hyperkind, and then there was Saint Sinner, and they were new comics that were based upon his concepts.
Yep, I found him right here. Yeah, Saint Sinner, which is very funny, considering that the other 2 were properties that had already been turned into media, so there was a lot more to help sell the line. Whereas like Saint Sinner didn't have a movie until like what, 2000, 2001.
Did Saint Sinner ever have a movie? I didn't.
Yeah,
I didn't
they did.
That.
It was on Sci-Fi Channel. I remember this distinctly because I had a very fond memory of wanting to watch it, and then I didn't. Here's the reason. So it was 2001. I had finally just gotten a car again after my last car had crapped the bed, let's just say. And I remember the advertisements on Sci-Fi Channel, and it was coming out on Halloween night on Sci-Fi Channel. Clive Barker's Saint Sinner, and I believe that's what it was. I swear to God, I thought that Saint Sinner had its own movie. But anyway, early days of the internet message boards, I had been talking to this girl online. She said, hey, you got your car? Why don't you come out to Lowell and let's meet up finally? So I ended up spending Halloween night with her. I completely forgot about this movie.
Not a bad way. Yeah. Pretty cool.
Nothing obviously ever came of it, but I never watched the movie, but it's still, you can find it on DVD, but I swear to God, I thought this had a movie. I guess you're right. Yeah. 2000. Okay, so the movie is listed as 2002, but I remember it coming out in 2000, 2001, but I may be wrong.
No, okay. So I did not realize those had any, spin-offs on that. So yeah, Marcus McLaurin became the editor of much of the Barker material after I left staff, and I was either consulting editor on some of it, or worked as a freelance editor on some of it as well, and maintained, I contributed to a lot of them. That kind of continued on for a while.
So the Razor Line that had I blinked and missed that completely when the Razor Line came out, but I had seen its typeface, that logo. And I was always wondering if the Razor line, because of when it started in 1993 and only went to 1995, was this Marvel's response to Image Comics?
No, not at all. Marvel's response to Image Comics was kicking out a bunch of older artists and bringing in, talent to draw more like Image, on their own titles. No, this was Clive marketing Clive. Again, Clive being a successful media property generator, and saying to Marvel, like, I have new ideas, I have new intellectual properties, I will give you some first right of refusal on these things that I will create and I will shepherd, and I will give, some influence and some additional press to, through his own activities, which, is a win for a publisher, right? If you've got somebody like that who's willing to kind of bring new properties in and then be a cheerleader for them. But, he wanted to kind of cross the border a little bit between pure horror and I think his fan interest in a little bit more superhero stuff, because the Razor line stuff is while it has horror elements to it, it also has a little bit more action, to it. Not totally traditional superhero stuff, but definitely more action oriented than, say, the Harrowers or Nightbreed or certainly Hellraiser.
Was there ever any question of bringing up of crossing like Clive Barker's characters into the regular Marvel universe in some way, like with Doctor Strange or something?
Yeah, I have no idea, because I wasn't really involved with the Razor line aside from, editorially it was developed with Mark McLaurin. I didn't write any of them. I didn't work on any of them. I read them, but that was the full length, and I was close with Marcus. He was editing me on other things, but if there was a conversation around crossing over, that never came across my radar. There might have been. That's always sort of certainly a way that publishers try to boost sales on things sometimes, or try to kind of integrate things. DC did that with some of the Milestone work, very early on, after Milestone had its first surge and then went through some shifts. They did some crossovers of some of the Milestone characters with the DC characters. But I don't know of any discussions with the Razor line. Could have happened, but I'm not aware of it.
Or the Epic line?
Well, the Epic line was a little messier, right? The Epic line, where, again, most of the Epic stuff is creator-owned, and where you got some of those the crossover you got from that was Pinhead and Martial Law.
Right.
Because Martial Law was a creator-owned character created by Pat Mills and Kevin O'Neill. And then, in some dark night with a hookah pipe, I guess, in between a bunch of people, there was like, let's cross over Pinhead and Martial Law. Which to me is just like, I'm not sure that was the best idea. I wasn't involved with that either. That kind of came after my staff time. It's got its moments, but it also sort of, I think, doesn't do justice to either character, really. I don't think it does justice to Pinhead, and I don't think it does justice to the best things about Martial Law, which, if you've never read Martial Law and you ever find the collected edition, it sort of predates The Boys by many years, and you'll see a lot of what The Boys, the Amazon, show, and that the comic it's based on, tried to do, except I think better much earlier.
How long did you stay on the Epic books for?
Well, I was an editor there until, I don't know, whenever I left, late 80s, I left staff, but I continued my association with them for some time, up through the mid 90s, when the kind of crash happened that affected so many comics. I was still very much involved in Hellraiser. I would write some stories. I would often do the intros to the issues. I would write the back cover copy. I would consult on projects like the summer special. I was the freelance editor on the Weave World project, so I brought that together. Got the talent together through that, shepherded that. I was the writer on Nightbreed, for a good long while on the Nightbreed Hellraiser books. I conceived that idea and wrote that 2-issue prestige series, if you will, and then I sort of brought the Pinhead book to life with Eric Saltzgaber, with the plan to sort of pass the baton to him after the first 6 or 7 issues, which I did, to sort of give him a little bit more of a leg up and an in, and that had its moments, but I don't know that makes as much sense to do an ongoing series around a character like that, especially when it had cover copy like a traditional superhero comic, which kind of looked ridiculous.
With the Epic books going into the early 90s, you were doing the Midnight Suns at the same time and writing between the two.
Yeah.
Did one lead to the other? Help lead to the other because you were on Epic and they were like, "Hey, we're launching a bunch of horror mainstream Marvel titles," and you worked in Epic.
Not necessarily. No, I would say almost guaranteed not. There was everybody knew each other. Everybody was very collegial. We were all like friends and colleagues on stuff. But for the most part, the Epic comic stuff was not looked upon in a lot of detail by folks who worked on the regular Marvel stuff. Whatever you guys are doing over there, we don't know what it is. It's kind of strange, though, so we really don't pay much attention to it.
Uh-huh.
And unless you're doing something with a Marvel character, like Electro Assassin or Havoc Wolverine, crossover that was worked on at one point, or the Silver Surfer thing that Mobius worked on. My entree to the Midnight Suns had more to do with a Ghost Rider guest spot I had done in Daredevil that had made a favorable impression on the Ghost Rider editor, Bobby Chase, who would then sort of lead the charge on the Midnight Suns work, and that was probably the bigger in on that. I don't even know if she was aware of any of the stuff that I was doing. A considerable amount of stuff that I was doing in terms of horror through Epic.
Did you have to read a lot of Clive Barker's stuff prior to did all of the team have to read everything Clive Barker did before working on those comics?
No. I mean, that wasn't of necessity. That would be crazy. I mean, I was familiar with Clive's work, from the moment that I was a big Stephen King fan, and the minute Stephen King had given him that awesome kind of career-shaping quote, I've seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker. Mm-hmm. Like any decent horror fan, you're like, well, who's this Clive Barker guy? So I searched out his work many years prior to working in comics, and enjoyed his work and was familiar with him, and certainly Hellraiser as a film was a breath of fresh air in terms of what else was out at that time. It's a lot of slasher films and repetitive stuff. So Hellraiser had its own vibe. So I had a groove on for him, I think, prior to him coming in with those initial ideas. But we set things up so that people, while the more familiar they were with it, the better. But we also wanted to kind of be able to recruit people who might know Clive Barker's name, but might not know the whole length and breadth of his work. So you couldn't say, well, you got to go watch all these movies and do all this stuff to do this. That was the point of the Bible, right? The Bible would give you pretty much everything you would need to know about this world. If you want to go look at other stuff, great. Here's some other references you can go look at. And we would be able to provide artwork. And, if you're going to feature Pinhead, here's some, Pinhead illustrations or Chatterer or anything mm-hmm. like that. So we were able to give them those materials. But we didn't try to drop any barriers on getting some talent involved. The only time we would ask people to really invest themselves in something more was for example, on the the original first 5 issues of Nightbreed, the comic, was an adaptation of the film, really more directly Clive's original screenplay, because the film got changed somewhat considerably between his screenplay and the first cut of that film that came out. So we had gotten that screenplay in, and we got that screenplay to the writers that we had hired, or I had hired, John Grant and Alan Davis, and obviously asked them to read the screenplay to get themselves up to speed. But generally, you try to make it low effort, on the part of people to kind of get involved. They should be interested. They should be jazzed about it. You don't want somebody who's going to come on the book and say, "Well, I think all this is the devil's work." Well, maybe you're not the right person to work on it then.
Just real quick, talk about some of the artists that were on these epic books. Like Bernie Wrightson, was one of the artists, and he has passed away. I'm not sure who else has passed away that's no longer with us that worked on these books.
Well, probably some people, unfortunately. That's the passage of time. But Bernie was a great get. Did one of the stories in the first issue, which is terrific. One of my favorite stories, The Warm Red, by a guy named Jan Stranad, and Bernie did the artwork. We had John Bolton do the first covers, Ted McKeever, Mike Mignola. We had some classic guys like Dan Spiegel. We had people like Bill Sienkiewicz,
Yep.
Dennis Cowan, Kevin O'Neill. Like I said, I pretty much went after Jorge Zafino, some really prominent, both maybe a little bit more independent artists, and also some, big name value type folks who we tried to pull into the mix. So they were all there. Mike Manley did the artwork on the Weave World piece. Brett Blevins was the artist on a lot of that Nightbreed stuff, did some fabulous work designing some new Nightbreed monsters, and he does great women, and really, I think, shined on that book. Mark Nelson, who was well known at that time for doing the first Aliens adaptation. I had brought him in on some of the Nightbreed stuff, and he did some incredible monsters and Nightbreeds, for that as well. So really just it's kind of a who's who, actually, if you flip through those comics, which I don't know if there's ever been true justice done to. I know there have been different collections of them in sort of one way or the other, but they really deserve, kind of a prestige-ish collection in their own right. Just when you think about the caliber of talent that's in there.
Mm-hmm. What we got like about 2.5 minutes left. What brought the line to an end? Was it just the folding of Marvel's a lot of their divisions because of their bankruptcy?
I don't know. I don't know about the bankruptcy, per se. I know the market crashed in '96 altogether. Bankruptcy may have been around that time as well. Publishing goes in highs and lows, and that was a significant low. And the comics industry as a whole had to retreat. And I think because these books were not part of the core universe of Marvel, they're not a core priority, and they also need an advocate. They need somebody who's going to fight for them and defend certain things. I mean, the first issue of Hellraiser, there was a story in there that at the last minute the publishers wanted to pull because they thought it was too raw, and I went to bat for it and threatened to quit, actually.
Oh.
As if anybody would care, but said, this is the whole point we're doing this book. The book is called Clive Barker's Hellraiser. If I'm not going to rankle some attitudes, we're not doing the job right. And got them to back off and run the story as it was. Probably didn't make me any fans in the moment, except among the creator community. But you need people who are going to defend that stuff. And I think the combination of Epic no longer having a real identity of its own, the crash in the marketplace, maybe not having as many people on staff who really wanted to, go to bat for these things that were outside the norm. It's just, there's no there's no there to kind of continue it on its own momentum. It requires more than just, keep going, and so they go on, and Clive may have found a happier home at some other publishers. After that, people who are more directly jazzed with working with him, and maybe gave him other opportunities. I'm not sure where he continued with the any of his comics work after that.
Boom Studios eventually, but that was like many, many, many years later. Also, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this little piece of Marvel history, which again I don't see that much of. I really appreciate it.
No problem, Chris. Thank you.
Where can people find you?
They can check out that newsletter of mine, storymaze.substack.com is probably the easiest way. Check it out, read it, subscribe, get some updates on what's going on.